Welcome to Empathy Stories, where ordinary people show extraordinary courage and compassion in the face of life's most unexpected challenges. Today, we bring you the thrilling tale of Jake Carter, a teenage janitor, and Margaret Hayes, a blind woman with a dangerous secret. Their encounter will remind you of the profound power of kindness and bravery. Stay with us to uncover how one small act of empathy unraveled into a life-changing adventure filled with danger, courage, and hope. Jake Carter was just another teenager in Chicago, a city alive with movement and energy, where stories of dreams, hardships, and hope intertwined like the threads of a vast tapestry. At 16, Jake already knew too well the weight of responsibility. With his mother working double shifts as a nurse and bills piling up at home, he had taken up a part-time job as a janitor at Chicago International Airport. It wasn't glamorous, but it helped keep their heads above water, and Jake was proud to do his part. On this particular day, the airport was a chaotic symphony of rolling luggage, hurried footsteps, and announcements echoing through the halls. Travelers rushed about, their faces a mix of stress, excitement, and fatigue. For Jake, however, it was just another shift, dressed in a faded hoodie and sneakers worn from years of use. He dragged a mop across the tiled floor near Gate 14, blending seamlessly into the backdrop of busy professionals and vacationers. Jake knew how people saw him, just a kid, someone invisible in the grand scheme of their important lives. But he didn't mind. His mom had taught him early on that the measure of a person wasn't in how others viewed you, but in the choices you made when no one was watching. As Jake cleaned, he noticed an elderly woman standing near the seating area. She wore a cream-colored coat and an elegant scarf, her posture upright, yet cautious. Her dark sunglasses and white cane revealed her blindness, and her tentative steps suggested she was struggling to navigate the bustling terminal. Something about her presence stood out amidst the hurried crowd. She seemed almost out of place, a figure of grace and vulnerability in a sea of indifference. Jake paused for a moment, his grip tightening on the mop handle. He had learned long ago to mind his own business in a world that wasn't always kind to people like him. A young black teenager trying to carve out a life without drawing unnecessary attention. But as he watched the woman hesitate, her cane tapping uncertainly against the floor, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling in his chest. She reminded him of his grandmother, who had passed away a few years earlier. His grandmother had been fiercely independent, but in her later years, she had sometimes needed a steady hand to guide her. Jake could almost hear his mother's voice in his mind, urging him to do the right thing. Still, doubt crept in. What if people misunderstood his intentions? What if they thought he was bothering her or trying to take advantage of her? The last thing Jake needed was trouble. Yet, as he stood there, frozen in indecision, he saw the woman stumble. Her cane caught on a suitcase left carelessly in the aisle, and she nearly lost her balance. Instinct took over, and before he could second-guess himself, Jake moved toward her. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said gently, his voice cutting through the noise around them. "Do you need some help?" The woman turned her head toward him, her features softening into a small, grateful smile. "Oh, thank you, dear," she replied, her voice warm but slightly strained. "I seem to have lost my way. I'm trying to find gate 22B, but I think I've wandered too far." Jake nodded, his nerves steadying as he spoke. "I can take you there. It's not far." As they began to walk, Jake guided her with a careful hand on her elbow, weaving through the crowds and the chaos. He could feel the weight of curious glances from strangers. Some curious, others suspicious. It was a feeling he was used to, judgment from people who didn't know him, who only saw his skin color and assumed the worst. But Jake refused to let it bother him. This wasn't about them. It was about doing the right thing. The woman introduced herself as Margaret Hayes, and as they walked, they fell into an easy rhythm of conversation. Margaret had a calming presence, her voice steady and kind, and Jake found himself relaxing despite the ever-present hum of the airport around them. "You're very kind to help me," Margaret said, her fingers gripping her cane tightly. Not many people would stop. Jake shrugged, though he knew she couldn't see the gesture. My mom always says it's important to help when you can. Besides, it looked like you could use a hand. Margaret chuckled softly. Your mother raised you well. Jake smiled, though he felt a pang of sadness. He wished his mom didn't have to work so hard just to make ends meet. But he pushed the thought aside, focusing on guiding Margaret safely to her gate. As they neared gate 22B, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. A man in a trench coat and a baseball cap had been following them at a distance. At first, Jake thought it was just a coincidence. After all, the airport was crowded, and people were always rushing to catch their flights. But as they turned corners and navigated the terminal, the man seemed to stay close, always lingering just far enough away to avoid suspicion. Jake's instincts, honed by years of navigating uncertain situations, told him this wasn't normal. Ma'am, he whispered, leaning closer to Margaret. I think someone's following us. Margaret's grip on his arm tightened slightly, but her expression remained calm. Don't stop, she said softly. Just keep walking. Jake's heart raced as he glanced over his shoulder. The man was still there, his gaze fixed on them, his movements deliberate. Jake felt a surge of fear. Why would anyone be following Margaret? She seemed so harmless, so ordinary. But the man's presence suggested otherwise. As they reached the gate, the tension reached a boiling point. The man in the trench coat closed the distance, his expression cold and his hand disappearing into his coat. Jake's mind raced with possibilities. Was it a weapon? Was Margaret in some kind of danger? He didn't have time to think. Acting on pure instinct, Jake stepped in front of Margaret, positioning himself between her and the stranger. Who are you? Jake demanded, his voice trembling but firm. What do you want? The man's gaze hardened, his silence only adding to the tension. Margaret, however, remained calm. Her voice was steady as she spoke. Don't do this, she said, addressing the man directly. There are too many witnesses here. The man hesitated, his eyes darting around the terminal. For a moment, Jake thought they might be safe, but the man's expression twisted into a sneer, and he took another step forward. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He was just a kid, a part-time janitor with no training or experience in situations like this. But in that moment, he knew he couldn't back down. Margaret was counting on him, and he couldn't let her down. Get out of the way, the man growled, his voice low and menacing. Jake stood his ground, his heart pounding in his chest. I'm not going to let you hurt her, he said, his voice shaking but resolute. Before the situation could escalate further, Margaret's voice cut through the tension. Jake, we need to move. Now. Without wasting another second, Jake grabbed Margaret's arm and started walking briskly toward a quieter section of the terminal. The man shouted after them, his voice filled with anger. But Jake didn't look back. His only focus was on getting Margaret to safety. When they finally reached a secluded area near gate 22B, Jake felt his knees weaken as the adrenaline began to fade. Margaret, however, remained composed, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos they had just escaped. You did well, Margaret said quietly, her voice filled with gratitude. But this isn't over yet. Jake looked at her, his mind racing with questions. Who was Margaret? And why was she being followed? What had he just gotten himself into? The answers, he knew, would change everything. Jake barely had time to catch his breath before the weight of the situation sank in. His pulse was still racing, his mind filled with fragmented thoughts and unspoken fears. Margaret sat beside him on one of the cold, metal chairs near the gate, her hands folded tightly over her cane. Though her face remained calm, Jake could sense the tension in her posture, the slight tremor in her grip, the way her shoulders seemed just a bit too rigid. Who was that guy? Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His gaze darted around the nearly empty terminal, his eyes scanning for any sign of the man in the trench coat. Margaret let out a long, steady breath. I wish I could tell you it was just a random stranger, she said, her tone measured, as though she were weighing each word carefully. But it's far more complicated than that. Jake frowned. Complicated how? Why would someone follow you? He hesitated, unsure how to phrase it. You're just an ordinary person, right? Margaret turned her face toward him, her blind eyes hidden behind dark glasses that now seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 untold stories. I haven't been ordinary for a very long time, she replied, her voice soft but tinged with an edge of something darker, regret, perhaps, or fear. Before Jake could press her further, the sound of hurried footsteps reached his ears. His heart leaped into his throat as he instinctively glanced over his shoulder. A new wave of panic surged through him as he spotted the man in the trench coat emerging from the corner of the terminal. His eyes locked on them with a determination that sent chills down Jake's spine. He's back, Jake whispered urgently, his voice cracking. What do we do? Margaret didn't flinch. Instead, she straightened her posture and reached for Jake's arm. We move, she said firmly. Stay close to me. And don't look back. No matter what happens, just keep moving. Jake didn't argue. He helped Margaret to her feet, and together they began walking briskly toward the quieter end of the terminal. The man followed, his footsteps growing louder and more deliberate with every passing second. Jake's palms were clammy, his stomach twisting into knots. He could feel the weight of the man's gaze on their backs, like a predator stalking its prey. As they turned a corner, the terminal seemed to grow eerily silent. The bustling crowds and echoing announcements faded into the background, replaced by the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the shuffle of their hurried steps. Jake's anxiety mounted. The farther they went, the fewer people there were, a fact that didn't escape him. Why is he after you? Jake asked, his voice hushed but laced with urgency. What does he want? Margaret's grip on his arm tightened as she quickened her pace. He doesn't want me, she said cryptically. He wants something I have. Jake's mind raced with possibilities. Was it money? Documents? Something valuable enough to make someone this desperate? But before he could ask, Margaret spoke again, her tone sharper this time. Whatever you do, Jake, don't let him separate us. If he does, things will get much worse. Jake swallowed hard, his chest tightening as fear clawed at him. He wasn't a fighter, and he certainly wasn't prepared to face someone who looked dangerous enough to belong in a crime movie. But he had come this far, and there was no turning back now. As they reached a long, dimly lit corridor, Jake felt a wave of unease wash over him. The air seemed heavier here, the faint hum of airport activity barely audible in the distance. It was as though they had entered another world, one where the rules of safety and normalcy no longer applied. Margaret suddenly stopped, her head tilting slightly as if she were listening for something. Jake froze beside her, his breath caught in his throat. He could hear the man's footsteps approaching, slow and deliberate, echoing ominously in the narrow space. Step away from her, the man growled, his voice low and menacing. Jake turned to face him, his legs trembling but his resolve firm. He stepped in front of Margaret, shielding her from the man's line of sight. No, he said, his voice wavering but defiant. You're not getting near her. The man's lips curled into a sneer as his hand disappeared into the folds of his trench coat. Jake's stomach churned with dread. Was it a weapon? A gun? He didn't know, but the mere thought made his knees weak. Margaret, however, remained eerily calm. You don't want to do this, she said, her voice steady and authoritative. There are too many witnesses here. The man's eyes darted around the corridor, his expression shifting as he calculated his next move. Jake could see the conflict flickering across his face, a battle between the urge to act and the fear of drawing too much attention. For a moment, Jake dared to hope that the man might back off, but the hope was short-lived. The man's sneer deepened, and he took another step forward. You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into, the man said, his tone dripping with disdain. Jake's hands balled into fists at his sides. He felt helpless, outmatched, and utterly terrified, but he refused to back down. Margaret had trusted him, and he wasn't about to let her down. What do you want from her? Jake demanded, his voice cracking with both fear and determination. Why are you after her? The man didn't answer. Instead, his gaze shifted to Margaret, his expression hardening. You know why, he said coldly. And you know this isn't over. Margaret's grip on her cane tightened, her knuckles turning white. You'll get nothing from me, she replied, her tone unwavering. Now leave us. The man's jaw clenched, his hand still hidden in his coat. For a moment, Jake thought he might lunge at them, but Margaret took a step forward, her presence commanding despite her blindness. Go, she said firmly, her voice echoing through the corridor like a warning. Or you'll regret it. The man hesitated, his eyes narrowing as he weighed his options. Then, with a snarl, he turned on his heel and walked away, his footsteps fading into the distance. Jake let out a shaky breath, his body trembling with the adrenaline coursing through him. What had just happened, he asked, his voice barely audible. Margaret turned to him, her expression softer now, but still tinged with urgency. That man isn't working alone, she said. There will be others. We need to keep moving. Jake's heart sank. The danger wasn't over. It was just beginning. As he followed Margaret down the corridor, his mind raced with questions he wasn't sure he wanted answers to. Who was Margaret? Really? And what had he just gotten himself into? Jake's legs felt like they could give out at any moment, but he forced himself to keep moving. Margaret's grip on his arm was firm, her steps purposeful despite her blindness. Jake marveled at how composed she seemed, even after everything they had just been through. He, on the other hand, was barely holding it together. His mind buzzed with unanswered questions and a creeping sense of dread. They finally stopped in a small, dimly lit break room near the edge of the terminal. Margaret guided Jake to sit on a worn chair by the wall, her movements careful and deliberate. She, too, took a seat, her posture upright and calm, though Jake noticed her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted her cane. The air in the room was heavy with the scent of cleaning supplies, and the faint hum of a vending machine filled the silence. Jake broke the quiet first. Who was that guy? Why was he following us? His voice cracked under the weight of his fear and confusion. And why did he say this wasn't over? Margaret let out a slow breath, her expression softening with a mix of regret and resolve. Jake, you've been dragged into something far bigger than you realize, she began, her voice steady but tinged with sorrow. And for that, I am truly sorry. Jake blinked, leaning forward in his chair. What do you mean? Who are you? Really? For a moment, Margaret hesitated, as if she were weighing how much to tell him. Then, with a quiet sigh, she began to speak. Years ago, I wasn't just an ordinary person, she said. I worked in intelligence, covert operations, gathering information for people in positions of power. Politicians, diplomats, even heads of state. My job was to uncover secrets, the kind that could change the course of nations. Jake stared at her, wide-eyed. You were a spy? Margaret smiled faintly, though there was no joy in it. Something like that. But my work wasn't limited to governments. I also gathered intelligence on people who operated outside the law. Arms dealers, corrupt businessmen, individuals with dark and dangerous agendas. Over the years, I compiled a file, a comprehensive record of their activities. Jake frowned, his mind struggling to process her words. And that guy, he wants the file? Margaret nodded. Exactly. That file contains information that could destroy lives, ruin empires. There are people willing to do anything to get their hands on it, and to silence me. Jake's stomach churned. Why don't you just give it to them? Maybe then they'll leave you alone. Margaret's expression hardened, because in the wrong hands, that file could cause unimaginable harm. It's not just about me, Jake. It's about protecting the innocent people who would be caught in the crossfire. Jake ran a hand through his hair, his thoughts spiraling. He had thought he was helping a blind woman find her gate, but now he was caught in something that sounded like the plot of an action movie. So, what now? He asked, his voice shaky. Are they going to keep coming after us? Before Margaret could answer, the sound of footsteps echoed outside the break room. Jake's heart leapt into his throat as the door rattled. He shot a panicked glance at Margaret, who was already on her feet, her expression sharp and focused. Stay behind me, she whispered. The door creaked open, revealing two men in airport security uniforms. Jake felt a brief surge of relief, until he noticed the cold, calculating look in their eyes. Something about them felt wrong, like they didn't belong. "We heard about an incident," one of the men said, his voice smooth but unnervingly detached. "We've been sent to escort you both to a secure location." Jake's gut twisted. He didn't trust them, not for a second, but before he could react, Margaret leaned closer to him and whispered, "They're not who they say they are. Be ready to move." The men stepped into the room, their gazes fixed on Margaret and Jake. "Come with us," one of them said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Margaret's hand moved subtly to her pocket, and a second later, a piercing, high-pitched alarm filled the air. The men winced, clutching their ears as they staggered backward. Margaret seized the moment, grabbing Jake's arm and pulling him toward the door. "Run," she said. Jake didn't need to be told twice. He followed Margaret as she led him through a maze of narrow hallways and service corridors, her steps surprisingly sure for someone who couldn't see. The alarm continued to blare, disorienting their pursuers and adding to the chaos. They burst through a door and found themselves on a small service road outside the airport. The cool night air hit Jake like a shock, and he stumbled to a stop, gasping for breath. Margaret, however, remained alert, her head tilting slightly as if listening for something. "We're not safe yet," she said quietly, "but help should be here soon." Jake looked at her, his chest heaving. "Help?" Before he could finish, the roar of an engine cut through the night. A black SUV sped toward them, its headlights piercing the darkness. Jake tensed, unsure whether this was friend or foe, but Margaret's posture relaxed slightly. The vehicle screeched to a halt, and two men in tactical gear stepped out, their movements swift and efficient. One of them approached Margaret, nodding respectfully. "Ms. Hayes," he said, "we've been tracking your signal. Are you injured?" "I'm fine," Margaret replied, her voice calm, "but we need to move quickly. There are still agents inside the airport." The man nodded again and gestured for Jake and Margaret to get into the SUV. Jake hesitated for a moment, his mind racing with questions, but Margaret's reassuring touch on his arm urged him forward. Once inside, the vehicle sped away from the airport, leaving the chaos behind. Jake sat in stunned silence, his hands gripping the seat as he tried to process everything that had happened. Margaret sat beside him, her expression serene despite the danger they had just escaped. After a few minutes, one of the men in tactical gear turned to Margaret. "We've apprehended the man in the trench coat," he said. "He'll be taken into custody for interrogation." Margaret nodded, a small smile of satisfaction crossing her face. "Good. That's one less threat to worry about." Jake finally found his voice. "So, it's over?" Margaret turned to him, her smile softening. "Not entirely," she said, "but for now, we're safe." Jake let out a shaky breath, relief washing over him. The fear and adrenaline that had fueled him for so long began to fade, replaced by an overwhelming sense of exhaustion. As the SUV sped through the quiet streets, Margaret placed a hand on Jake's shoulder. "You've shown incredible bravery today." "Jake," she said, "you could have walked away, but you didn't. You stayed, and that means more than you'll ever know." Jake met her gaze, his chest swelling with a mixture of pride and humility. He didn't feel brave, he felt terrified, but Margaret's words carried a weight that made him believe, even for a moment, that he had done something extraordinary. As the night wore on, Jake couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. He had started the day as an ordinary teenager, just trying to get through another shift, but now, he had stepped into a world far beyond his understanding, a world of danger, courage, and choices that tested the limits of his character. And though the road ahead was uncertain, Jake knew one thing for sure. Sometimes, doing the right thing meant facing incredible odds. But in those moments, you discovered who you truly were and the strength you never knew you had. As we step back and reflect on the journey of Jake Carter and Margaret Hayes, the story leaves us with profound lessons that resonate not just for them, but for us as well. Through their actions, fears, and triumphs, we see the universal truths that emerge from their extraordinary encounter. For Jake, the story begins with a simple act of kindness, a choice that could have been as small as walking away, but became monumental when he chose to help. Jake teaches us a vital lesson. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. Jake was not a hero in the traditional sense. He was just a teenager, overwhelmed by the weight of his responsibilities at home and the judgment of the world around him. Yet, when faced with a moment of moral clarity, he stepped forward. He put aside his insecurities, the fear of being misunderstood, and the daunting reality of standing against danger, to do what he knew was right. The lesson here is that even in the most ordinary of us lies the potential for extraordinary courage. Jake didn't save Margaret because he sought recognition or reward. He acted out of empathy, compassion, and a belief instilled in him by his mother to help those in need. His actions remind us that true strength is not found in bravado or physical power, but in the quiet resolve to protect and uplift others, even when it comes at great personal risk. Margaret's story is one of redemption and accountability. Once a covert operative who delved into the shadows of powerful and dangerous worlds, she found herself carrying the weight of her past choices. Her decision to keep the file and protect its secrets, even at the risk of her own safety, highlights a profound truth. Our past does not define us, but how we respond to it does. Margaret could have handed over the file to save herself, but she didn't. She recognized the harm it could cause in the wrong hands and chose to take responsibility for it. Despite the cost, this selfless act reflects the transformative power of accountability. Margaret didn't just carry the burden of her secrets. She wielded them to protect the innocent and to ensure that justice could prevail. Her calm composure in the face of danger also teaches us the importance of resilience. Though blind, Margaret navigated her circumstances with unwavering resolve and clarity. She reminds us that physical limitations do not equate to weakness and that strength lies in adaptability, resourcefulness, and the courage to confront the consequences of one's past. Together, Jake and Margaret illustrate a timeless lesson. Acts of kindness and bravery, no matter how small, can set off ripples that create profound change. Jake didn't know that helping Margaret would lead him into a web of danger. Nor did Margaret anticipate finding an ally in a teenage janitor. Yet, their bond, rooted in compassion and mutual trust, became a force that overcame the threats against them. The trust they placed in each other despite their vastly different worlds highlights the power of human connection. Jake, young and unassuming, could have been dismissed as insignificant in the grand scheme of things. Margaret, an elderly blind woman, could have been written off as powerless. But together, they proved that strength comes not from status or ability, but from shared humanity and a willingness to stand together against adversity. At its heart, this story reminds us that life often presents us with moments where we are called to act, not for recognition or reward, but because it is the right thing to do. Jake's courage and Margaret's resilience show us that even in the face of overwhelming odds, it is our choices, not our circumstances, that define us. And perhaps the most profound lesson is this: kindness is never wasted. It may not always be easy, and it may not always be without consequence. But in those moments of selflessness, we find the strength to rise above fear and doubt. Jake and Margaret's journey is a testament to the transformative power of doing what is right, even when the stakes are high and the path is uncertain. Thank you for joining us on Empathy Stories. Jake and Margaret's journey teaches us that even the smallest acts of kindness can lead to extraordinary outcomes, proving that courage and empathy have the power to change lives. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more incredible tales of resilience and humanity. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear how this story resonated with you. See you in the next story.